likely to be eaten. You are likely to be eaten by a group. If this predicament seems particularly cruel, consider whose fault it could be. Now the torture a match in your inventory. You are likely to be eaten by a group. If this predicament seems particularly cruel, consider whose fault it could be. Now the torture a match in your inventory.
It's a good mix of programming and story. And the Infocom games blended those two things really well.
Craftsmanship was leaps and bounds ahead of what anybody else that I was aware of in the 80s was doing.
It was written by people who knew how to write, they knew how to design a game.
They wrote in complete sentences, they knew where apostrophes went.
Very professionally done, so I knew that every time an Infocom game came out, it was going to be extremely high quality.
If you were going to have a game for a computer, you wanted to have something like what Infocom was doing in the early 1980s.
Like just about everybody else, we worshipped the Infocom work and were just amazed by it. And I was amazed by it.
Infocom took it a step further by actually creating more of an interactive novel.
I am fascinated by the history. I'm hoping, actually I'm looking forward to finding out more about it.
When it started, basically 7 people got together and said, let's do a company.
Infocom was founded almost entirely by MIT affiliates, students, some researchers. The dynamic modeling group was the main source for that startup. Infocom wasn't founded, as I understand it, to be a games company.
The people founding the company wanted a name that would fit all types of software. They weren't just intending to be a games company, and I'm sure if they were, they would have had a much more interesting and entertaining name.
They were going to do something that involved taking what they knew, what they had done at the Institute, and commercializing it and making some money off that. But it wasn't clear what that was going to be.
And then there were some meetings where it's like, okay, we have a company. Now what do we do?
To the best of my recollection, lawyers taught me to say that, I thought it would be a software development house that could succeed on a small scale, at least. So we talked about various projects, document tracking in an insurance company, calculating nutritional content of foods and meals for somebody who had to keep track of that.
And I'd say, because I'd spoken to Joel, and Joel and I would say, we can do Zork. This is very popular, on the ARPANET. We think it would make a good game, but it's going to take a bunch of work and this and that, and a lot of tools. And everyone goes, oh, that would be a great start. Among computerish jargon or just where we were, it was sort of an exclamation like, Zork, this has happened or something. So the only thing I take credit for is having had to come up with a name, and that was what popped into my head, and people started calling it Zork, but and now it sounds like Zork is always what it was. I mean, it was just a nonsense word at the time.
The thing that got me interested in doing this in a literary way as well as a technical way was that I have been, a voracious reader. The writing I've done, I've always enjoyed, and I've always looked at doing more writing. And so the idea of combining writing and programming, it was like, wow, how can I do this for my whole life? It was great.
I was working in a lumber mill, and I saw an ad in the paper for game tester for Infocom, and I had played their games before. So I applied for the job, and a few weeks later I was out of the lumber mill and testing games.
I started beta testing Infocom games.
we just kind of naturally got into this rhythm where it made sense that I should maybe come up and start doing some microcomputer work for Infocom, because they didn't really have a microcomputer division.
At the time, there was this bulletin board system out called CompuServe, and one of my office mates was a regular customer of CompuServe, and one day he knew I was very much into the Infocom thing, and he brought to my attention an ad that Dan Horn had placed. Dan was the head of the microcomputer group there, and they were looking for an engineer from the microcomputer group. So 45 seconds later, I was in the Infocom offices applying for that job, and I got in.
Got to Massachusetts on a Thursday. I looked in the newspaper, and the want ads that weekend had a job for 2 testers. And I applied for them and was interviewed a week later and got the job 2 weeks after that. I mean, I just walked into it.
I wrote 3 novels before starting in interactive fiction. I was kind of sat down in front of a terminal and said, okay, here you go, have at it. I was brought in, I think, as their big experiment. Here's a writer who knows nothing about programming. He kind of knows what he's doing, let's give him a shot.
There was this job for an editor that appeared in the Boston Globe. What I later heard was they didn't really want to hire an editor, but Mike Berlyn, having published some books, said, I have an editor at a publishing company which does the kind of things that we're looking for, so let's advertise for an editor. That's what caught my eye, and that's how I ended up going Infocom.
Starting with my freshman year, I started writing for the MIT newspaper. It's called The Tech. They're on the top floor of the student center in this big corner suite. The other big corner suite down the hall was a group called the Lecture Series Committee, LSC. The way they used to advertise was they had a printing press that printed out these 17 by 22 multicolor posters that they put up all over campus. That printing press always seemed to be running, even on days when I knew a movie wasn't coming up and that the posters had actually been done. Every now and then I'd wander down to LSC to figure out why this printing press was running full tilt. And there are always these same 2 or 3 guys in there, and they were printing something out that clearly wasn't a movie poster. But they were also being very cagey about what it was that they were printing. Among those 2 guys were Mike Dornbrook and Steve Moratsky.
Well, I mean, Mike worked at the Lab for Computer Science. He was there at the founding of Infocom. He loved, his work right from the very beginning. He was the original Infocom tester. He also was sort of the first Infocom customer support person. He would handle all the hint requests, which would come in by snail mail just to a post office box in Cambridge.
And so we ended up sharing an apartment in Arlington for about a year. And during that time period, when I started testing Zork 1 for Infocom, eventually we had to start testing on the target machines, and they let me borrow it. I had it on the dining room table in the apartment. And the first day I had it, when Steve came home, he opens the door. And now Steve, you have to understand, went to MIT, but found computers and the folks who were, fanatical about computers to be, what's the word I'm looking for? He despised them, basically. I mean, he considered it all kind of a waste, kind of, a bunch of nerds. And he came in the back door and saw the computer, and he went, away! As only Steve could. And so I started telling him, Steve, you're going to love this. All you have to do, and I was trying to explain to him, how to start the game up, and he puts his hands over his ears and starts screaming so he can't hear me. But apparently he heard enough, because over the course of the next several weeks, I started noticing when I'd come home and want to start testing again that the keyboard might have moved a half an inch, or my notes had moved slightly. And I realized, I think Steve's playing the game and isn't willing to admit it. And so one night he finally broke down and said, all right, I need a hint! And that was the beginning of the end for Steve.
One of the nice things about Infocom was that almost everybody was unique in their own insane sort of way. And Steve was just even more unique than some of the rest of us.
Without being superlative or not sounding too fawning, it appears that you just...
Go ahead and sound fawning. Yeah.
Here's a man with a degree in civil engineering, from MIT, testing games.
And it just suited him perfectly. I mean, it's just a great great fit, but he kind of worked his way up. It's like, he loved to play him, so it's like, okay, we need testers, and he's so meticulous and so detail-oriented that he could do this. He could play the same thing 100 times, to tell you whether the bug is fixed.
I definitely really liked what I was doing then. It came really easily and smoothly.
But he was so into it, and he had so many ideas, at some point you say, okay.
We were doing so much more than any other entertainment product on those machines. We were providing so many more hours of entertainment.
When we were in Infocom, we knew we were making product, but we were very excited about the product we were making. The goal was to create something different and new and exciting, something nobody had ever seen or experienced before.
The Infocom games lasted for years on the shelves, partly because our return policy didn't let the dealer send them back, but also because text is timeless. I mean, if prose doesn't go out of style.
In the initial mailing list we had, I think 10% of the addresses had MD in the name. The folks who owned a personal computer in 1979, 1980 were a fairly wealthy crowd.
Most of the games cost between $40 and $50 at the time. And in today's dollars, I guess that makes it quite expensive. But the goal for your $40 was to get 40 hours of entertainment.
Most people didn't solve most of the games. There are people they'd have 10 of them and not have completed any of them.
Mike Dornbrook, the marketing guru there, a very clever fellow, put together a survey, and he asked people, how many Infocom games have you bought, and how many have you played, and then he asked how many have you finished. And turned out people have never finished many of them. They just like to own them.
For the first several years of Infocom, all of those kind of groundbreaking packages like Deadline or Starcross, which was the game that was packaged in what looked like a white UFO, or Suspended, which was the package that had kind of a death mask built into it. Those packages were all done by a company called GR in Watertown.
It was really kind of an accident with Deadline. Up to that point, stuff pretty much came in baggies, and it was really just a disc in a simple manual.
Mark and other people at Infocom were very enamored with a series of books many decades ago, maybe even as early as the 1920s.
There were these interactive books, really. A whole bunch of clues, a whole bunch of materials that creates essentially a puzzle that you solve.
A portfolio of, kind of what a detective might be handed to try to solve a crime that you were just expected to sift through, study, and put together your own hypothesis on who did it and why.
And he had played a couple of those, and he started thinking about doing something like that for Deadline and actually providing a bunch of additional materials in the package. And so they put all the police reports and all of the evidence that was found on the scene or whatever in a police dossier, and added another $10 to the cost of the game, and had a much more interesting looking, product in the store, and it sold like crazy, and people loved it.
To have a game with such elaborate packaging as Deadline was just a huge breakthrough.
I would say it's a toss-up between either the star-crossed saucer or the suspended face mask. Just because it was completely unlike anything else that had been done at the time, and really there isn't anything else that has been done since. The problem they ran into with that is retailers hated those huge odd-shaped packages because, they're hard to display on a store shelf.
So like when Starcross came out, there were stores that hung them from the ceilings all throughout the store. They were floating in the air, flying saucers, and people who would do really elaborate stuff with the boxes when they first launched. But the problem was 3-6 months later, they didn't know what to do with them. And so we came up with the book style package that allowed us to still have room for interesting stuff, but would solve many of the problems at retail in terms of how they were shelving them. So it was kind of a compromise.
Dornbrook gets, I think, good credit for taking just a uniform box, but making it work, having it browsable and seeing the feelies. Given that he standardized, given that we standardized the packaging, did a pretty good job with that. Once I got there, I'm like, crap, I need to learn these games because these guys are all talking about, this puzzle and that puzzle, and they know what they're talking about, and I don't know what they're talking about, so I guess I better learn. So after putting in a day at the office, I'd go back to the office on my VT100, and my wife would come along, and we'd bring her Chinese food or whatever, and we'd play the games and have a great time. But, my folks coming up saying, so what do you do for a living? Well, come on, let me show you. And so, I remember my mom and dad, they're 60 years old, and they are all playing Witness together, and it was a lot of fun. It was just great.
And I think when Deadline came out, the first mystery game, there was a definite feeling of, wow, this is really something new and different.
But what really got me turned on was Deadline. So that just blew my mind. I can relive this story over and over. And eventually, by looking at it from different angles and connecting the dots, then I could find out what's really going on.
A lot of people consider Deadline to be just a big thing, in the sense it was the first time anyone had tried to make a story in a traditional genre. I mean, something that wasn't just the fantasy, a D&D style thing. You could sort of sit in one place and people would come and go and things would happen. And I love that idea that the world was alive.
There were games that, at the time they were being written and tested, everybody in the company got excited about and realized that this was a special game in one way or another. For example, one would be Trinity.
Casting around for an ambitious idea, and I had this idea of a historical game based on the testing of the first atomic weapon. The subject matter I found really interesting. It's a very important part of 20th century history, one of the most important moments, arguably, and it just had a lot of dramatic potential, I thought. It came out just right after the Commodore 128 came out, and Trinity was virtually the only game made that was actually designed to support the Commodore 128 in native mode. And so everybody who bought a Commodore 128 had to buy Trinity. And as a result, the sales were fairly respectable as a result of that lucky coincidence.
I don't remember the exact course for all the other first-time writers, but essentially it was sort of, I'd like to do a game of this general kind, and they would pitch it, and people would say, hey, that sounds like it might be cool, and so off they'd go.
I should say what I was trying to do with Plundered Hearts was have a way you could play it just as an adventure, and then a way you could play it as a romance. In retrospect, when I saw Pirates of the Caribbean, the first movie, I thought that's what I was trying to do. That movie is what I was trying to get my game to play like, that whole experience. It was a surprise when 10 years later, I'm in graduate school in Minnesota and somebody, a high school or a college kid, knocks on my door and says, "Are you the Amy Briggs? I played Plundered Hearts in 5th grade. It was my sister's game, but I played it with her." I always make clear that the guys were only playing it because it was their sister's game.
I guess it was after Moon Mist, I got a card that said, "I'm a writer." From the Mystery Writers of America. I got a membership. That was fun.
It was, oddly enough, Timothy Leary who said that I had changed his life, which was kind of funny in a way. He had played Suspended and was completely overwhelmed by the way the characters split reality into 6 pieces. He had not thought much of computers before then, and thought that that product had made computers a reality for him. That's my favorite.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's very good to be here. I do need to explain, first of all, that I'm not a graphic artist. But on the other hand, the artists that we use, that we've hired at the Digital Village to do this particular project, the reason we went with Softimage was very simply, we hired the artists we wanted. We said, "What do you want to use?" And they said, "We want to use Softimage." In modern times, I guess it was many years ago when I did a version of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy with a company called Infocom. Now,
he had played one of our games and thought it was really neat and wanted to meet us and wanted to get involved and wanted to do a game.
He approached us. We never approached him.
I happened to be walking by the front door when he came in, and unescorted, and no one there to welcome him. And I had to ask who he was, and he told me, and I said, "Well, you probably want to go and talk to Joel or Mark or somebody."
Oh my God! We got Douglas Adams desperately wanting to write a game with us. He wants to do Hitchhikers with us. There's no question this isn't going to be a success.
When I heard that Infocom was going to be doing a version of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that's all I had heard. Someone said, "Hey, Infocom's doing Hitchhiker's Guide." My first reaction was, well, it's got to be Moretzky. He's the only guy who could do it.
And so I actually maneuvered things such that Steve ended up collaborating with him, which was not really what Douglas wanted, but actually I thought probably the best match for him.
Douglas was a big technophile. He was, a game player himself. He'd played Suspended and liked it, and so it was not a match that required a lot of work to bring to fruition.
Well, it's funny because, you ask Steve and he'll admit that there were a whole bunch of things that he was incredibly frustrated working with Douglas, because Douglas is the biggest procrastinator on the planet. It was, he would admit it. I mean, the reason he was doing the game at all was to get away from doing the book that he was supposed to be doing. Where Steve is so incredibly organized and so methodical about getting things done. It drove him nuts that he couldn't stay on schedule and he couldn't get what he was supposed to get when he was supposed to get it. So in many ways, I think it was a really good collaboration, although it was, I'm sure, very frustrating for Steve. I've, run into so many people where that was their introduction to, Infocom games. They went on to play others. They, even if they didn't solve it, not that many people made it all the way through. They had a good time. They enjoyed it.
Again, from my experience from within, the whole company, we were all very young.
We weren't married, we didn't have kids, and we were starting out, and everything was fun and new.
As a younger person, just all of these great, nice adults, which is, I don't even know if I want to call all of them adults.
Most of us were single. We would just live there. It was our home and our family as well as our workplace. I'd get into work to test, at 9:30, 10. I'd work till 6:30 or 7, and then I'd work on the game for 2 or 3 hours. Go out to dinner with somebody, else who was working late, come back. The company was open and there all the time. And then I worked all weekends. When I was sort of actively in the mindset of, I'm going to become an imp, I have to do this, I was getting up at 6 in the morning and coming in Saturdays and Sundays, too, to write my game on the weekends when I wasn't working.
Every Friday, Uno Fest, which caused more and bloodier battles than you could have possibly imagined.
Everybody was very bright, all right? And bright in all sorts of ways, not just about the computers. Bright, well, compared to me, high verbal acuity.
It was a supportive atmosphere. I don't recall, I know there must have been fights between imps, and I know that there were fights between imps, but I don't recall among us, except sort of supportive. Stu was the person I go to for parser stuff, Loveling for really complex stuff in programming, Steve for real questions for comedy, how to make something funny, or just how to get out of a pickle in the story. And then at the imp lunches, it was all just a free-for-all of people talking and suggesting.
The great pleasure of going up to Infocom was to meet with this incredibly smart group of people, to sit in on Imp's lunch.
Every week, 1 day a week, we'd have an Imp's lunch where we would get together and formally, officially share how the game was going, bring up problems, ask for help. Bob Bates, when he was sort of working for us but not yet part of the group, would come to those lunches.
When an implementer would come in and say, I've got this problem that I'm working on, and here's the situation, and I'm kind of stuck here, and then to see all the other folks around the table lend a hand at trying to solve that problem, that was an incredibly creative atmosphere, a very fun atmosphere to work in.
It was an opportunity for the less technical savvy to bounce issues off those who were more technically savvy.
Brainstorming from the biggest picture items down to the tiniest detail items.
It was everybody working on their own thing but together, and it worked pretty well that way.
We did get a visit from the president of Simon & Schuster. They were kind of thinking they'd like to acquire Infocom before anybody else did.
Because they were interested in possibly a partnership, possibly distributing our games through bookstores.
We flew down and we had lunch in the boardroom of Simon & Schuster, and one of the things that very much impressed me is this guy had a private chef. So they wanted to buy us. And they were part of Gulf and Western. They made an offer in late '84 of $28 million to buy the company. Now at the time, the board was thinking the company might be worth around 10. And So obviously, most people would think if you offer almost 3 times what you think the company's worth, you might take that seriously.
Flew to Cambridge, arrived in a limo, took 3 of us to lunch in the limo. And that was impressive, but that was all that impressed me about them. I didn't think they really knew what we were about.
I believe we decided to keep them waiting to let them know that we would not be cowed or impressed by a mere Fortune 100 company. That, after all, we're Infocom. We make a couple of $1 million a year. We're big cheese. And I don't think we heard back from them ever again.
And I wasn't actually at the meeting, but got this from Mark and Joel. Apparently, Al started hemming and hawing, and I don't know. And the guy said, "Look, if it's just a matter of a few $1 million, I don't care. I'll pay you more. But are you or are you not interested in selling?" And after more hemming and hawing, he just got fed up and walked out the door, and that was it.
Albert came and asked me, I think he asked a lot of other people, what we thought about cutting a deal with, an acquisition with Simon & Schuster. And I said, well, personally, I don't want to work for the guy who would be in charge of us. I'd met him long enough to know that he didn't understand us. And so if that was going to be the outcome, I was against it.
1 year later, we were lucky to get $2 million for the shareholders from Activision for the company. I mean, they took on a debt of about $6 million, so from their point of view, they paid about $8 million for us. But from the point of view of the shareholders of Infocom, it was about $2 million.
Tombstone? Yeah.
Did you have any impressions on the product at the time?
The puzzles were way too hard.
I really just didn't pay too much attention to it at all. I mean, I knew it was there. I knew there were other people working on it. I just didn't give it much thought or much attention.
A lot of the founders of Infocom did not believe the games were credible, worthy of time, or interesting pursuits. And it was their goal always to fund real product development with the game division.
Of course, it did start out as interactive fiction, as games, and that was tremendously successful. But Infocom also had a business division and was working to get a relational database to market.
A lot of people, kind of mistell the history of Infocom by saying, oh, and then after the success of games, the company made the bad decision to try to get into business products. But in fact, both efforts were from day one, and it was merely that the games, being a much smaller effort, were able to come out much more quickly.
So what they did is they basically cloned Infocom and made a second Infocom, and that was the business division. Separate marketing department and a second advertising department and a second Deck 2060, which was extremely expensive at the time.
That was a tough one. I mean, I'm sure this makes a great, business school case study. I mean, there are a lot of problems. I mean, fundamentally, Cornerstone is a terrific product that came out before its time. I think had the potential to be enormous.
As a database, it actually did a pretty good job. It was easy to use compared to DB2 and Fox Pro and everything else back then.
I don't have anything bad to say about any of the people who are working on development. I mean, some of the smartest people I've ever known. I think they were doing exactly the right thing in exactly the right market, but in exactly the wrong company.
The fact that they sucked every penny out of Infocom to fund business products because they believed that business products had merit and games did not, is what killed it.
Well, I think Cornerstone is what resulted in the info austerity program. That's a term that I hadn't remembered for quite some time. Info austerity meant that the $400 a week party budget went to zero. Contribute out of your pocket if you would like to.
It's very, very hard to have a company that has multiple focuses and to get investors to understand or want to be involved in the whole thing unless it tells a good single story. And the people who would give money for one thing didn't want the other, and the people who would give money for the other didn't want the first. What we ended up doing was killing them both. But fundamentally, what we did was not going to be successful, even though we had great people and great products. I mean, it's a very sad story.
It wasn't even Cornerstone. It was this attitude that I spoke of games not being real worthwhile endeavors. That's what killed it.
I mean, it did take on a life of its own. I'm not really sure how it started, but when Activision bought the company, we had a wedding. And so we, mapped out the whole thing, printed up invitations.
Well, at first the buyout looked promising. Activision under Jim Levy, who was the president when he took over, was a fairly benign guy. He had a taste for kind of quirky, interesting games. He had shown that by some of the things he had recently published, like a poetry processor and little computer people and weird kind of stuff like that. So he seemed like a good match. And so at first it looked like we were going to be okay.
When we were bought by Activision, I remember how disheartening it was having this summit at some rather dreary hotel in Cambridge. We're sitting around in a big U shape, and one of the heads of Activision, he said, "Our motto is, if you can't be best, be first." And you could just see all the Activision people nodding their head, yeah, if you can't be best, be first. And I remember all the Infocom people kind of looking at each other going, that doesn't sound good for us.
The former board was not the board anymore. There was just whatever minimal number of directors was required, and they were Activision people. So if push came to shove, they would tell us what to do.
Yeah, I think Activision was collecting baubles. My understanding, which I think everyone's understanding is partial, but my understanding is they made a ton of money in the cartridge video game industry, which then collapsed. But that ton of money was still in their bank, and so they couldn't spend it on working on the cartridge industry because there was no cartridge industry. And so they decided to go out and acquire.
Less than a year after we were acquired, Jim Levy, who had been instrumental in wanting to acquire us, he left.
But Levy didn't last very long. He was replaced by, what was his name? Oh, yes, Bruce Davis, who was one of the members of Activision's board who was against the acquisition of Infocom and felt that the company had paid too much and actually sued the founders to get some of the money back.
And the new management seemed to be, one of its goals seemed to be to prove that they could do better, that Jim had made mistakes and that they could correct them. So if Infocom was one of those mistakes, then they would be rigorous with us and make sure that what could have been a bad investment would turn out okay if they were in charge.
When Bruce Davis came in, he made some pretty strict demands about the kind of things we'd be doing, how many games we ought to be making a year and that kind of thing, and it didn't work out. By the time I left in '88, it was clear that, the arc was heading downward. We were getting less and less support from Activision, and we'd had a lot of layoffs, and it was beginning to feel pretty desolate there. And, we didn't have the resources to experiment anymore. We just had to turn the crank as fast as we could. So when you get to that point, that's when the rats start, looking over the side of the ship and saying, I wonder how deep it is.
May 3rd, 1989, it was announced that, quote, Infocom is moving to California, unquote. This is in a company meeting. And I remember letting out a laugh at that saying. I knew it was impossible to move the concept of Infocom anywhere else. But yeah, that's when I was laid off.
And I didn't leave Infocom on particularly good terms, so, I wasn't sitting there going, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to them?
I think it was so intimately tied up with Infocom's acquisition by Activision that it took a long time after that. The Activision had managed to mess things up so badly from our point of view that the fact that the industry as a whole was having problems was something that we didn't begin to actually get until a little bit later.
If they just left, if they just left Infocom alone, Infocom would have survived, morphed, evolved into a different game company than what it was, but it would have still been making product.
And some of that we I think rightly thought was due to Activision's lousy marketing and lousy policies on sales and return and stuff. But some of it was just, there were a lot of games out there, a lot of subjects, there was the influx of better and better graphics having an impact, and we sort of argued about how one could combat any of those. But I would say it was not too long after the Activision acquisition that we began to see that there were problems. And initially we said, Activision is causing these problems, which was partly true. And then as time went on, we realized that not only was Activision causing the problems for us, but the industry itself was having problems.
I heard about it, I think, from Kelly's Mac. They were down to 18 employees, I believe. So Bruce, as they're going into bankruptcy or getting near the end, apparently it was like looking for any way he could to raise money. And so he offered the entire Infocom library to Bob Bates. When I found out how little they offered it for, I would have bought it myself. I'm sure Mark or Joel or any number of us would probably have swung for the cash to buy it all out. Because I believe they offered it for $25,000. All the Infocom trademarks, all the copyrights, all the code, everything. And when Kelly's Mac heard that was in the works, he said, that's nuts. We could make a lot more money than that just by re-releasing them as lost treasures of Infocom. And Bruce told him, well, if you can do it for, and he gave him, an itsy-bitsy little budget, like $10,000, I believe, to pull them all together, get a manual pulled together for them and put it out. Go for it. So he did. And, they still went through bankruptcy but that product came out just after bankruptcy, and they sold, as I recall, 90 to 100,000 copies, but they were charging $99.95 for it. So it had a huge profit margin, and it basically gave them the money to relaunch Activision, which is now actually the largest publisher in the world.
Oh, I'm always looking for another Infocom. I know the other implementers are too. If we could find a way to bring back what was really important about Infocom, I'm sure we would. Sometimes, though, I think it's because we won't give ourselves permission to do it. It'd almost be a sacrilege to try and revive it or something. But I would jump instantly at a chance.
But yeah, everyone I talked to was like, there'll never be another one of those.
When something dies young, you've got the Jimmy Dean, Marilyn Monroe, you've got these folks that you wish hadn't died so young. You wish you could bring them back.
It was just, a really exciting time, and it seemed like, the sky was the limit.
I'll make an admission, actually. I don't think that I finished a single Infocom game.
In the last 22 years, I've gotten one email. So.
Was it a good email?
He sent me a copy of Hollywood Hijinks and wanted me to sign it. But that's it.